Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Armin, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you very much for inviting me to your show. So I'm excited to be here. I'm Armin Krishnan. I'm an associate professor and director of security studies at East Carolina University, and I specialize in international security, intelligence, and military technology.
When it comes to intelligence, can you give me some examples of where you focus when it comes to intelligence?
Well, it's about intelligence agencies. So in the United States, we have an intelligence community consisting of 18 intelligence agencies. And what they do falls into three disciplines. So one is called positive intelligence, which is about the collection and analysis of intelligence. So intelligence is information related or concerned with national security. And what is also specific to intelligence, that there are special methods of collection, and particular clandestine methods of collection. And here, one technique is espionage, and other methods are technical in nature. And there is also open source collection. So that is one discipline in intelligence. The other one is called counterintelligence. So that is about countering the intelligence activities of others, which relates to preventing or detecting espionage, sabotage, subversion, and assassination. So that is the second discipline of intelligence. And then there's a third one that is called covert action. And there are different names for it in other countries. So the Russians or the Soviets called it active measures. So it's about the implementation of foreign policy in a manner that allows the sponsor not to take responsibility for those activities. So a major consideration in covert action is plausible deniability. So you're doing things that in a way that makes it very difficult for others to trace back the sponsor of the activity. And that is something the US government has been doing since its inception. So you can go all the way back to the War of Independence, that covert action was being used by the US government. So there's a long history of it, and other countries are doing it as well. And now covert action is sometimes called hybrid warfare. So that's another term that is being used. But the idea is pretty much the same. We want to destabilize another government, and we're using covert means to accomplish that.
Which one is the most understandable to you when it comes to like one that you kind of like go, "Dang, that's not so bad." Like when we hear propaganda tactics and things of that sort, I start going, I mean, everybody has propaganda. Everything's propaganda today. It just seems normal. It's in our movies, man. But then when we talk about things that I would say what I would have pause at, or I would consider ethically wrong or like questionable on the basis of ethics, like regime change strategies, stirring up types of animosity in another country to get them to overthrow. It's like regime change, but less assassination, more getting the people to do it for them. Those types of things I start to kind of have pause about, where I just don't think those are questionable. And I understand it might be other governments doing the same exact strategies, or maybe doing it in different forms, or maybe different names for it. But that's one where it's like I start to question that one on the basis of all the other principles that you listed.
Well, ethical considerations come into play, but it's more something that concerns democracies. And one of the reasons why democracies to choose covert action over other methods or means of implementing foreign policy is because what they want to do doesn't have popular support. So, so in a sense, covert action can be used as a means of overcoming constraints inherent in the political system. So the US government overthrew democracies. A famous case here is Iran in 1953. And one reason why the US chose covert action to do it was because the American people would not have supported it. And a similar thing in Congo in the 1960s. So there are ethical constraints that affect democracies much more than authoritarian states. And one particular framework that is relevant for everybody is international law. So we should uphold international law. So using terrorism or sponsoring terrorism is a major violation of international law. And that's the reason why the State Department has the list of state sponsors of terrorism, where we try to punish other governments for using those kinds of techniques. And of course, assassination would also fall under international terrorism. So these are things that should not be done. And if they are exposed, it can cause some trouble for others. So we're now designating, for example, the Wagner Group as an international terrorist organization. So the Wagner Group is a mercenary group similar to the Foreign Legion of the French that the Russians use in Ukraine and also in other conflicts. And now the US government says that is actually a terrorist organization. So
how are they labeling it as a terrorist organization?
Well, they are saying that they are not legitimate. So they are you can only use international force, force internationally when you're using your own armed forces. You cannot use private citizens.
They're outsourcing.
Technically, you cannot be a lawful combatant unless you serve in the armed forces of a nation, or if you are in guerrilla organization with a clear chain of command. So using mercenaries is actually a violation of international law. The US government has done that as well. It's a bit hypocritical that they are now labeling the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization, since we have had groups like Blackwater USA, which is now called Academy. And these were used as combatants in places like Iraq.
Now, when it comes to, you said a law, international law that everyone should follow. Do you expect them to actually listen to the law that they might even establish? Like, I know we say like hypocritical, but in a sense, it's just like, are you going to trust another country to follow by some rules that you establish and you handshake on? And I understand there might be consequences of that, but the CIA was never supposed to activate on domestic land, and I think there's enough evidence to show that they did. And I don't know if they're still doing it, but possibly I would believe so. So, it brings up questions of like, if you make a rule and get everybody to sign by it, I was like, but who's going to follow the rules? When I look at everyone's government, I just picture everyone holding a gun to each government's head. Like, it's just like everyone's waiting for someone to do the first move or do something. And they're all up to something where I feel like they don't call each other out or expose each other because they're probably doing the same thing. And everyone's got a list of blackmail that they can use.
Well, there's always a question, how real is international law? There is no enforcement mechanism behind it other than individual members of the international community imposing sanctions of some kind against violators of international law. So we do not have an overarching authority that could impose penalties on governments that violate international law. So international law is different from domestic laws. So in a domestic context, you have a government, and the government can enforce those laws. However, international law is not insignificant, is not unimportant. So we have rules that are widely accepted. So for example, the Geneva Conventions are widely accepted, and all governments can be held to account for compliance with the Geneva Conventions. So if a government decides to ignore the Geneva Conventions, then any member of that government or military that is captured can be tried as a war criminal. And that can be done by any government that captures that individual.
But that seems like more risk for the person that's involved. It's kind of like when I was learning more about the Cold War and they were using, CIA operatives or spies or anything like that. There was like, if they get caught, what happens to the person that gets caught? And the government just goes like, we didn't know the guy. Like, obviously, no accountability, nothing can be traced back to a certain agency. So, I mean, it brings up questions.
I mean, there is an international criminal court. I mean, the idea was not just to go after the low-level people, but after the high-level people. So they had some high-level war criminals like Milosevic, the president of Serbia, who they tried there. And then there was the other one, Charles Taylor from Liberia. Obviously, there is a lot of bias in the way the International Criminal Court operates. So the US government is not even part of it. And obviously the International Criminal Court would not prosecute any American individual. But the idea when they established it was that we can hold leaders of governments accountable for major violations of international law, especially as it concerns issues like genocide or ethnic cleansing or other major violations of human rights. And so,
do you think
is
it doing an effective job at it? Do you think that, like, is there any things that you would suggest that would be? I mean, how many times do people get caught? Is the thing. It's like, I'm pretty sure everybody's probably breaking international law right now. I'm breaking legal laws right now if I'm hooked up to somebody else's Wi-Fi. I didn't know that was a law. So, I mean, how many international laws are being broken by certain government organizations and they just don't get caught?
Yeah, I mean, the standard method of dealing with violations of international law is just to impose sanctions on other governments. So that is something that happened directly after the invasion of Ukraine in February last year. The US government and the EU have imposed major economic and financial sanctions on Russia, including the seizure of the central bank assets of the Russian government and of other financial assets linked to individuals, as well as limiting the trade between the West and Russia. And the hope is that
I'm sorry about that. That freaked me out. I was like, I don't know if I froze or you froze.
Okay. So the West has imposed sanctions on Russia, and the idea was to change the behavior of Russia because of the severity of the sanctions. So it was an attack on the Russian economy, and it doesn't seem to be working. But it has been used against other countries as well, in particular Iran and North Korea, in the context of their WMD programs and sponsorship of terrorism. So that is a major way of addressing violations of international law. However, you are absolutely right. Many countries violate international law. It's just a matter what's the severity of the violation and who is the violator. So when it comes to the United States, there is no country that effectively can punish the US government. So for example, the US government decided to invade Iraq in 2003 in violation of international law because Iraq did not attack the United States, so there was no case for self-defense. And Iraq also did not attack any US allies in 2003. So the US didn't have, and there was no UN Security Council resolution that would have authorized the attack on Iraq. So you can say that there was a violation of international law by the United States, but the international community was not able to do anything about it because the United States was at that time the global hegemon and arguably still is. So there was no recourse. But it works more or it works better against smaller countries like North Korea or Iran.
Do you think, like, if you had ideas about reform, I mean, are you critical when it comes to the America having the exception type deal from international law, or nobody can prosecute the U.S.? I mean, I think everyone kind of has problems with like wars like Afghanistan and Iraq. And it leads into, I mean, another thing that you kind of focus in, which is military technologies, where I start wondering, I mean, when are we going to start seeing certain things be implemented that are very, very dangerous to a point where those have to now be in effect into international law, that other governments cannot use this type of technology? I mean, the technology that we're using is getting insane, to the point where I don't see things catching up. It was the hypersonic missile that was talked about not even 6-7 months ago. It was everyone was freaking out about this missile capabilities that we have. And I start going, we're going to get to a point where you're not even going to know. You're just going to blink and you're going to be gone. So you start getting into, when is it too much? And when is this going to have to be regulated, as we cannot use this, much like we did the nuclear test ban treaty back when Kennedy was president. I mean, even though that was atmospheric, so it was only a surface ban, they could test them underground, it was still a step in the right direction when it came into recognizing the power that these things had and what they really were holding. I mean, you can't just wave them around.
Well, during the Cold War, international law was not effective because of the bipolarity. So you had the Soviet Union and the communist countries on the one hand side, and then you had the democratic countries, the West, on the other side. And they couldn't reach any major agreements at the level of the UN Security Council. And then the Cold War ended in 91, and there was hope for a new world order, which was kind of a hope for a rule-based international system that would be guaranteed by a quasi-global government, presumably the United Nations, and that international norms could be strengthened, and that all major powers would now be working together in order to preserve that international order and to establish a more peaceful world. And as you know, that didn't work out. So we are kind of back to the Cold War situation, where we have a major dispute between some of the permanent five. So the permanent five have a veto right in the UN Security Council. So if the United States government doesn't like anything that Russia and China are proposing, they can veto it. And if Russia and China don't like anything that the West is proposing, they can veto it. So this makes the United Nations or a world government dysfunctional, and this affects arms control as well. So we are seeing that now in the arena of nuclear weaponry, which has achieved some comeback. So I remember something like, when was it? At the start of the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, they were talking about global zero. So they were talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether, or at least majorly reduce the available nuclear weapons in the world. And that didn't happen because we had the crisis in Ukraine since 2013, 2014. And this has affected arms control agreements, and several major arms control agreements have ended as a result of that. Most importantly, the INF Treaty in 2018, the Open Skies Treaty. And there is a question with the New START Treaty, which has been extended until 2025, but nobody knows what's going to happen in 2025. So we're just keeping the nuclear weaponry at the existing level. We are not reducing anything. And we are even modernizing our nuclear weaponry. So we are putting a lot more money into it. It's $1 trillion project at least. So you can see that there is new technology in that arena that could come online, such as hypersonic missiles, and the Russians have some of them. They have nuclear-powered missiles. They have the Poseidon thing, so that's the unmanned underwater vehicle that can cross the Atlantic.
Wait,
And
what? Wait, what? I've never heard of
yeah,
that.
it's a it's can be launched from a submarine. It's like a torpedo, and it's nuclear powered, and it's a dirty bomb, so it can cause massive radiation at the coastline. So
Dude, it's like if
so
you
they
ever
have that
read
as a deterrent
Operation
weapon.
Cherry Blossoms at Night, which was the plan that Japan had to launch these missiles at San Francisco's coast with 150 million fleas that were infected with bubonic plague. It's like that stuff where it's like you hear, you're like, oh my God. And then it's like, I mean, I don't know who thinks of half of this stuff. I feel like they have a dartboard and they just throw it and see what new idea they're going to create sometimes. But the dangers in that, where it's like, look, in that heat of that moment, if you're trying to think about beating your enemy, you're going to use whatever you possibly can. But with hindsight, you kind of notice that's a really bad idea. That's not going to just mess up a country. That might mess up a lot more than that.
Yeah, we can certainly destroy the world, or at least empty the world of humans. And there are many ways of doing that. We have a lot of very advanced technology, including biotechnology, which concerns me a lot. And the other thing that is happening on that technology front is autonomous weapons. So I expect that autonomous weapons will be fielded, probably in the context of the Ukraine war. So I can.
Do you ever think it'll get to a point where they'll have fully autonomous like robots that just do the fighting for us and there won't be people doing that? I've heard people bring up that argument saying that like, oh, it'd be better if we had robots doing the fighting for us. I go, no, because it's going to make the sliding scale for us to go to war 1,000 times easier for them to be able to, if they're not going to lose lives and they just lose parts and technology, they're going to be more than happy to start a battle or do anything of that sort just to, I don't know, get some frustrations out.
Well, humans would become just collateral damage
That's true
in
too.
a conflict between robots. So, and obviously, you can't win a war by just destroying robots. If you want to affect the determination of the enemy, you have to inflict some real pain on the enemy. And how do you inflict pain? You're targeting the humans, not the robots, right?
Well, that's a really big problem with just military operations in general, is that there's a large amount of attacking civilian populations, um, as collateral damage, I guess. But there's not even a thought that comes to mind of like, oh, we might be, dropping the bombs if we take it back to, way back a little bit. But all the civilians that were there that were just, not a part of whatever the government was doing might not even agree, but that happened and people lost their lives. I mean, that's throughout many operations. It doesn't really matter about the people that would be surrounding, that would be involved, that would be considered collateral damage.
Yeah, that's the point of modern warfare. I mean, that is often overlooked, but the consequences of war are just as severe as they were during the Second World War or in the First World War, but it's not as obvious. So the impact on civilians is more indirect. So according to some estimates, 1 million people were killed or died as a consequence of the Iraq War from 2003 to 2011. So that is a huge number of people. And if you just look at the combat deaths, which are much, much lower than that, you get the wrong picture. So why do civilians die? So we are so dependent on our technology. So if our power grid fails, if our emergency services fail, if there is not enough food or medicine, then people die. So there are many circumstances under which people can die as a consequence of war. And we're seeing that in Ukraine as well. So I think the casualties in Ukraine are much, much higher than they are reported. And yeah, and it's a wrong assumption to assume that just because we have precision weapons and we can just attack the military targets and some critical infrastructure, that it would be less bloody or people would be suffering less. I don't think it's the case. So we are living in a much more dangerous world because we are so highly dependent on our technology. I mean, civilian technology. So imagine what happens if there is no electricity. and the electricity doesn't get back on after a week or two or a month or a year, I mean, civilization just collapses.
Well, how do you fix the paranoia? I feel like a lot of this is fueled by the paranoia stuff, which is I don't, if we set guidelines or, there's laws in place, international laws, are people going to follow those things? We can improve the laws and put maybe harsher punishments on there, but there's still an aspect of people are going to do it without letting anybody else know, whether it's our government or another person's government, and that paranoia fuels reaching for bigger and more destructive things, more effective things in case something ever does happen. There's always that until the pen drops situation. And that's been throughout. I mean, you can look at every single war. It's until the pen drops or whatever. There's always something that is this, it's paranoia fueled. And I don't know how to get rid of that. I couldn't even think of it. I don't have any ideas of it. There's harsher restrictions, maybe more punishments, but it's like getting everyone to shake hands and really agreeing, like, hey, put your guns down. That type situation. Everyone wants to show off somehow. I mean, whether it's a missile array, a whole entire fortress filled with a bunch of missiles that you never use. There's always something just to prove that we have this. And that fuels more paranoia because there's a competition, whether it's, an actual competition or whether it's just something where it's just a buildup of weaponry.
But the thing is, national security is inherently paranoid.
I have no idea what it even means.
What it means is that the survival of the nation is constantly at stake.
But what does that
mean? We're living in
in
a dangerous world.
Okay.
And we can be attacked by anybody. It's the jungle, the stronger will eat the weak. And we have to do anything we can to protect ourselves against the various dangers that are out there. So we have nuclear weapons because others have also nuclear weapons. And since others have nuclear weapons, there is a possibility that they will use those nuclear weapons against us. That applies to any other kind of threat. So others have biological weapons. So we need to have our own biological weapons in order to be able to defend ourselves, or we need to have at least systems in place to detect biological attacks and to potentially contain them. So the world of national security is totally paranoid. And there's no way of getting around it. You can't simply assume that others will be nice.
Yeah.
You cannot assume that others will follow the rules.
With national security, though, it was kind of a joke because, I mean, I've talked to plenty of people who filed freedom of information requests just for flight logs of a certain person. And they're like, no, it's national security. And it's like, what does that mean, though? And I just go, you can just label anything national security and you don't have to chalk it up. What are they labeling national security? I mean, if you talk about an international problem, whether it's another government agency, secrets of the intelligence community, which I 100% agree with. Trust me, even after reading the Church Committee report, I agree. Some things need to be secret. But I also don't think your public should be that disconnected from what your intelligence operations or community is doing. And I mean, I don't even know. I'm not an expert in the intelligence things. I can just see where there were some moments where that sounds really crazy. CIA influence on college campuses is a big thing that would shock a lot of people. I don't agree with that at all, mostly because the CIA doesn't necessarily tell the people that they're hiring to join the CIA the inherent risk that are involved with that. I would accept it if they told, transparency on like, hey, here's what's going to happen if you get caught, and we can't be connected with you if you do get caught. It's going to international conflict issue. They know the risk, then it's okay in my eyes. Obviously, for other people, they might not want it at all, but there isn't that explanation or that transparency in the overall effect. I mean, if you have the FBI, they influenced movies and they're still doing it. The DoD does it too. The CIA does it as well. Is it okay to put minor propaganda in there? Dude, I'm okay with it. If you want FBI agents and Mickey Mouse cartoons, they want Mickey hanging out with FBI agents, that's fine. But if you read the Walt Disney file on the FBI, that's how the first page is. And then the last page is ratting out people that are striking up labor unions, calling them communists. And I go, you just developed an unhealthy relationship with J. Edgar Hoover, which is probably not the best idea in the world. So I start to go like, when you get trapped inside of those bubbles scenarios, I mean, if you explain risks if you explain the transparency of why you need to do something and there doesn't need to be, and I get it, intelligence agency secrecy is the key because our enemy will get those secrets. I understand that. But there's also like a very big disconnect where I'm like, you don't have to give us all the secret ways you gather intel, but also you shouldn't. There's some things like regime change, assassination plots. I think people are widely accepted in that scenario, but then there's certain measures of how they implement those things that sound crazy. And we're even if it's in the history books, I doubt they're probably using some of the same stuff today. They might be, but then when we talk about national security issues, look at the domestic front. I mean, what are you labeling? I could be a security issue. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. I don't know. That's a security issue, but I just that's what I'm saying is like defining what those terms are. They kind of leave it open door. And I feel like at that point, you can just start labeling everything a national security issue, and you never have to give transparency about anything that you're doing.
Well, I mean, there are clear guidelines as to what qualifies as needing classification. So there are certain types of information, mostly related to defense, continuity of government, technology, and intelligence sources and methods that are being classified. So, and that also includes operations. Intelligence or military type of operations that are protected by national security secrecy. But you're right, there is a problem in terms of democratic accountability. How can you have democracy if a large portion of what the government does is secret? And in particular, when that secret portion also affects or can potentially affect or undermine democracy itself. So the phenomenon that established itself in 1947 onward is the national security state in the United States, also known as the military-industrial complex, or more recently as the deep state.
Yes, that's what I believe in 100%. It's just the military-industrial complex, but it's funny when you look into the CIA, the FBI, and I wish someone would write a book about the NSA. Their documents are so interesting to me. I don't know why, but it's like I'm watching Jersey Shore, man. They just talk trash on each other. Like I think the CIA is incompetent, and that's like an FBI document. I'm like, bro, what is this? Is our? I thought they all work together. Nah, they don't. They don't at all.
Well, what is the deep state really about? It's about an unaccountable bureaucracy that is following its own ideas about what national security is and what needs to be done. And they have achieved a level of autonomy from the rest of the government. So you have the elected government. So you have the president and the administrations that change every 4 years or every 8 years. And then you have the unelected permanent government, which is the bureaucracy. And when it comes to the national security state, they have a lot of autonomy, which means that it doesn't matter whether an administration changes or not, certain policies are simply going to be continued. So there was a huge continuation in the national security area from the George W. Bush administration to the Obama administration, despite the fact that Obama wanted to change many things. But in the end, on key national security and foreign policy issue, there was a lot of continuity. And the reason for that is simply the existence of that deep state. So it's very difficult to deal with that deep state, even for presidents, and President Trump found out about it. So for example, he tried to change major US policies and the deep state simply said no to him. And they undermined him and then things didn't happen. So for example, he announced the withdrawal of US troops from Syria, I think in late 2018. And then the Pentagon simply said, no, actually, we're not doing that. And our troops are still in northern Syria. So if the deep state wants to do something, then it's very hard for presidents to change course.
I feel so comfortable with you that you believe about a deep state like I did. Whenever I say it, people just go, oh, God, deep state conspiracy talk. I'm like, well, hang on a second. Like, there's an unhealthy relationship with capitalism. We put a lot of profit, and that's kind of where a lot of actions can be justified, whether you want to call it, I mean, justifications for war. There are probably billions out there that people could list, but a lot of it is money motivated in some sense, and there is some direction of that. And that's what I considered a deep state for the longest time. I mean, military industrial complex is real. But people want to label it left wing and right wing. I mean, whenever I see someone in the media getting talked about, like I understand. I'm not a Trump supporter at all. I'm not a Biden supporter at all. Like I said, I believe deep state, so I kind of stay agnostic on all the political party type situations. But whenever I see people getting targeted, like extremely, whether it's the media sources or whether it's just everybody, I start going, why did that just happen? Like, what is going on? What is going on in the background of things? I mean, whether you give a couple examples like you just did about Trump, I mean, there's things where I start going, it just doesn't randomly happen. And an example I could give you is with Lyndon Johnson back before he became president. All the scandals that Life magazine had out about him that were getting ready to hit the press. And then he becomes president after Kennedy's assassinated, and all those scandals drop. And what do you say? Well, the media knows common sense. You don't want to talk trash on your president, like that makes a lot of sense. It's opposite of what goes on today. It seems like they rake them through the coals half the time. But I go, well, it's the media, man. Like the media gets their info from somewhere. The FBI is not going to let you trash talk their chief of staff if they're in agreement with their chief of staff. I mean, that can be conspiratorial if you want to say that's conspiratorial, but to me, it's just strategy. You're not going to let someone unless you want them taken out. You want people to hate that person, which has been demonized of Trump. They're getting demonized of Biden now. And that's when I start to kind of fall back from the discussion and I start going, I mean, is anybody else suspicious of why this is all just happening now? Like it's like smear campaigns. It'll get labeled that, but that's only because it targets both parties. It doesn't focus at the central problem. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? I don't want to sound like if I'm being conspiratorial, you can correct me. It's fine.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the infiltration of the media by intelligence services, that goes back to the Second World War era. I mean, already the Office of Strategic Services was working together with the advertising business and the media, and also the Department of War was working on propaganda in order to mobilize the American people. And that kind of continued into the Cold War period. And you mentioned Operation Mockingbird. So the CIA had hundreds of journalists in major media organizations, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC and NBC, and so on. So they were trying to manipulate public perception about the world and certain political issues. And that was discovered, I think, in 1977. And the CIA said, well, we did that back then, but we are no longer doing it. But I don't believe that's the case.
It's
So I
not.
think there's.
I got proof I can send to you that if you Google it right now, it says in 1963 it lasted 3 months. In the recent JFK release, the one that just happened in December, or when they were suing Biden, I had friends of mine that were the ones in charge of that lawsuit from the Mary Farrell Foundation. Documents, I think it was like on the third page. It's called, on top of it says propaganda news, and it says literally that there's this story that is coming out and you need to get your media assets to pitch this, and it's labeled that, and there's name redactions and there's a large chunk that's taken out at the bottom, but I'm like, what is that? And the document was dated 1965. So I go, in 1963 it said it only lasted 3 months, and this is from 1965. So now I'm calling you on your bluff. Like, but I think it's still happening today. I think the only reason they get to be able to pitch the stories if it's, I don't know, pitched at a certain party. Like I said, if it's attacking a Democrat or attacking a Republican. That's why I try and stay agnostic on it. It seems like nobody else wants to acknowledge their own shit. They kind of just point at the other ones. And I'm like, everyone's up to something, dude. I don't trust anybody. I'm paranoid as hell.
Yeah, I think they can change some of the reporting. I mean, we have this case with, what was it, Judith Miller in 2002. She got a classified briefing. I think she worked for the New York Times at the time, where she was given classified information about Iraqi WMD. And then she published some articles about that. And that was a major factor in pushing the case for war in 2003. So that was a clear manipulation of media reporting by the Pentagon. And yeah, we still have people who had some prior affiliation with intelligence services and then or the military and join major media organizations. I mean, the famous case is Anderson Cooper of CNN. He did an internship with the CIA when he was young, and you can believe that he is not being influenced by the CIA or not, but it's. I think there is a clear case that the CNN is getting instructions from the deep state, so how they are reporting things.
I believe it. I mean, even sometimes Tucker Carlson says stuff. I feel like he has to do. I'm not fans of any of. I don't like the news networks at all. But whenever Tucker Carlson says something, I'm like, damn it, what is he talking about? And then like he talked about the JFK stuff recently, and I've done extensive work into all of that, including the Joyon West connection with the MK Ultra. I have the documents, and I've been saying it for months before he said it. But as soon as he said, I go, oh God, please don't label this a right wing conspiracy because that's how people are going to view it. And I start going, I mean, if you really got to think, if you're going to be a news broadcaster and you're going to say anything about the government, you would have to do it in some type of grandiose, grand conspiracy type thing that sounds so ridiculous, even though it might be true, but you have to say it in such a way that's either comedy or something to make sure you don't get in trouble with the government. I mean, that's a real scenario. And I kind of think about that a little bit more. And it's weird. I don't ever see Anderson Cooper really mention anything that's really negative about the government. It's more about attacking like certain politicians or people that are, like here the I don't know if you saw the Nevada mayor on there during the COVID stuff. Dude, I've never laughed so hard in my entire life. He had her on her like, don't you think we should be following some conditions with China's protocols? And aren't you going to do it at some of your Nevada restaurants? And she goes, this isn't China. This is Las Vegas, Nevada. And I'm like, dang. Like, no way that just happened. But Anderson Cooper set that up. He knew it. He knew she wasn't intellectually as leveled as he is. And that's kind of what his show is. I mean, half the time I feel like he just loves, and I'm not bragging on Anderson Cooper. I'm sorry. But there's some things he's on there where the guy's like, yeah, I'm watching a tornado. It's like, don't you want to get to safety? And he's like, nah, I'm getting good footage. And I'm like, you could pick anybody, bro. You could find any normal human being that left that storm, but you picked the one that is obviously not paying attention to the real dangers of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of the mainstream media has been effectively turned into propaganda outlets. You can easily recognize that when there's consistency in the narrative or the message that they are relaying to the public. So propaganda requires consistency in the message, and it is highly repetitive. It uses emotional appeals, and it doesn't have any nuances. So it's always black and white, good or bad. And you can clearly see that in the reporting of the Ukraine war. So the Ukrainians are all good and the Russians are all evil. And it's just propaganda.
Well, look, they talked trash on Ukraine long before this all even happened. They had the reverse, they just 180 did. My issue is, when does it desensitize us? When does it become to the point like there are certain things like they'll tell us about or we'll know about that's not a national security issue, whether it's an operation or things we know about Iran and all this type of stuff now, whether that's independent researchers or other things. And we kind of go, okay, that was in 2003. It's horrible. And there are people that still want people to pay, and rightfully so. But then there's things that aren't being told because it's threats to national security. And I start going, when did we become so desensitized where the things that they're keeping secret now end up becoming public? And then there's even darker things because it's like even the church committee. I mean, recognizing all the problems that were going on and all the horrible things that were going on, everyone was shocked and taken back. But now it's getting to a point where if you mention anything, people just go, okay, well, let's not do that. And then what, okay, where's you need to get some accountability here on those aspects. And I feel like every time the news reports something, whether it's a certain political side, it's just desensitizing us to like some severe ethical issues that our government's up to. I mean, MK Ultra is a prime example, man. I mean, I don't I think they're probably doing something with LSD in another scenario, but that's a complete human ethical violation of things. And there's so much of that, even when it's related to operations overseas. I mean, if you look at the assassination plots on Castro, bro, exploding seashell. I hate to, I don't, I give you points for creative effort, but dude, that's pretty extreme. That's like something out of a movie or a child's book.
Well, I mean,
I said a lot. I'm sorry.
uh, so what was your question?
It's just about desensitizing us. I mean, do you think
Oh,
like
this. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that modern warfare is really about controlling populations, and it's mostly psychological warfare. So some call it fifth generation warfare or hybrid warfare. And what you're doing is really attacking populations with propaganda and other means of manipulating them and moving entire societies in a certain direction. And that is conducive to your political objectives. And if it's done by a foreign opponent, a typical objective here is to destabilize, so undermine the confidence or legitimacy of the government that they are attacking, and trying to demoralize people. And that can also mean encouraging defeatism and general distrust of government institutions and so on. And yeah, we have been desensitized also by the media. So we are no longer responding to major scandals. We are no longer that outraged because it has become so normal. I mean, we hear lots of recent revelations about the FBI and Twitter. So how the FBI is censoring Twitter. I don't know whether it's going on still. But that's a huge scandal because it totally violates the idea of democracy. And we are no longer functioning democracy. It's just a simulation of democracy. And people are not responding to it. I mean, we're just accepting what we are hearing. And that's a problem.
okay, good. So everyone say Twitter's going to hell in a handbasket. And I'm like, I mean, first of all, if an app is controlling your life that much anyway, then you got to probably take a step back a little bit. But there were some things. I mean, we talk about the smear campaigns and the power of media. People, as much as they joke about like news being fake and pitching stories, that's still, they have a large audience of things as well, too. And it was an issue when it came to like the Hunter Biden laptop stuff. That was a state away from me. And I knew that was real from the beginning, but so Zuckerberg was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and about an hour, he starts mentioning that the FBI came to him and started telling him that there was some disinformation going around, and we need you to start throwing it to the bottom of the search results or calling it misinformation or not being able to share the link. You could not send the link about the Hunter Biden laptop story. I don't care what your politics are, if you like Trump or if you like Biden, but okay. I thought you froze again. I'm sorry. You scared me for a second. You're good. But they said you can't, like, I mean, I don't care what your politics are when it comes to Trump or when it comes to Biden. That was a real story. And it was the FBI was telling Mark Zuckerberg to eliminate from the search results. And also Twitter was in on that as well, too. That's a real issue when it comes to democracy. I mean, if you're going to be more than happy to pitch stories about your opponent or scandals about your opponent, but not about the president and staff. I mean, I think you should be accountable for whatever you're doing. You know, there's open transparency in a government. I mean, that's how democracy works. And all these revelations that are coming on Twitter, I'm like, all you're doing is now fueling more conspiracies. You're fueling people to never trust you again. And the best thing that they can do is probably come clean about a lot of this stuff and it's manipulation of our minds, which I just don't agree with at all. I mean, we understand that they can track us from cell phones and things of that sort, but it became, now we don't care about it. We don't care about any privacy rights. I mean, if you ask somebody about cybersecurity, if their browsers and everything are up to date, if they're worried about being targeted with ads, do they care? I mean, they accept cookies and terms and conditions without reading it. They just want to get to the prize at the ending of the tunnel. And I'm like, I hate to say it, rats in a maze, but we just care about the cheese.
Yeah, I think the problem is that many young people do not even have a good understanding or grasp of the US Constitution and of constitutional rights.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
And they grew up in a time where um, there has been a lot of propaganda and a lot of distortion of reality because of propaganda, and nobody really knows how things should be working in a democratic country anymore. So when people hear about the surveillance that was going on, that was revealed in 2013, well, it was initially a lot of outrage by people when they learned about it, but that died down. So that is almost forgotten. And now we have the Russiagate scandal, which was largely made up for political reasons. I mean, I've looked a lot into the Russiagate investigation, and I understand that there was political motivation by the FBI and others in the government to undermine first the possibility of a Trump election victory and then smear the Trump administration from the very start in order to push them out of government. And and that's a huge problem for democracy. It shows that democracy is no longer working how it should be. And there were supposed to be watchdogs to prevent that. And there was supposed to be the media as a watchdog to inform the public about things and in order to change the or give people the option to vote for somebody else. And since the media are now so manipulated themselves, that does no longer work. And then we have the other big watchdog, which is Congress. And even Congress doesn't do the job as they should be
They didn't do
doing.
it
So
back in the 70s either, or the 60s. I hate to say it like
yeah,
that, but
there was no intelligence accountability until the mid 1970s. So Congress gave the military and intelligence services a lot of leeway. So they simply approved the money for them and were not actually asking how the money was going to be spent and what kind of operation they were doing. So individual members of Congress were kept in the loop, were informed, but Congress as a whole was clueless about a lot of things going on in respect to intelligence and clandestine operations and so on. And then they established the intelligence committees in 78, which were supposed to watch those intelligence services and prevent abuses. And as we know, the oversight was effective in the 1970s and also in the 1980s. But by the 1990s, it became weaker, and now it's like more like a rubber stamp. So they are probably still getting informed about important developments, but they are not actually holding the intelligence services to account. And you could clearly see that with the illegal wiretapping scandal that became public around 2005. And they simply changed the law, the FISA Amendment Act in 2008, in order to prevent Americans to sue the telecommunications companies involved in that illegal surveillance. And then they continued in a different way with the PRISM program and other surveillance initiatives that happened under the Obama administration and that were subsequently leaked in 2013 by Edward Snowden. And again, they simply updated the law and nobody was really held accountable. So from the perspective of the government, they didn't do anything wrong, but because of public concerns, we make a few little changes here and there to make sure that it's all accountable. But I don't think it really is. So
there's documents I could send you that I found doing research for the Kennedy assassination, but it's Hoover being able to talk about ways that you could kind of pass congressional oversight. certain ways that if you word it this way, it's more likely to get okay on it, or it's not going to be rejected or pushed back. And I'm like, dude, when you're doing something, anything, and it has to be kind of manipulated and twisted around in words to be able to go through because you know it's going to get flagged for whatever issue or violation, that's a problem. That's a really, you're probably not shouldn't be doing that. But I mean, like I said, it goes back to the beginning argument, which is everybody's government's up to something. It's just there's the intelligence community is just something to me that's just like it's mind boggling, mostly because there's things that you wouldn't think were even possible, but then they're possible, and it's just like, what do you do? I mean, if I'm that disconnected and I'm into all the deep state stuff, half the people aren't even a quarter of the mile there. And it's just like, there's no way to get anything done. I mean, do you see like in the next 10 years, 15, 20 years that you're actually going to start seeing a lot of change? Like what a second church committee, I've heard that be talked about. I was, I'm interested in that. I would be like to look into that if it's a live court proceeding, not a closed door testimony type deal. But I think there needs to be a connection, whether it's displayed on every news network, about a real court proceeding. More people watch the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard thing than anything political I've ever seen in my entire life. I think we can have another court testimony like that just to be able to get like a second church committee that exposes like, hey, this is what's going on. Get up to speed a little bit.
Well, it would be nice if we had another church committee, but I don't think it's very likely. So the federal government has become very dysfunctional, and there is no real incentive for Congress to go into the covert activities of the intelligence community and expose that, because it affects all the parties, and many powerful people could be implicated. So I don't see that happening at all.
I was hoping you were going to give me a little bit of hope there. Be like, yeah, we'll get it. We'll get it. We'll get it one day. But I'm glad people like yourself are at least talking about it, at least studying a lot of this stuff as well, too. I mean, it's needed. Normal people don't have these types of conversations on a daily basis, at least in my circles. But it's also getting the younger generation to actually care about it, but doing it in a smart, strategic way, too. I don't agree with all the burn it down type mentality. I would have called myself a libertarian at a point, but they are too anti-government for me. I'm more about, look, we need to understand the proper procedures and what is ethically right and what isn't. And then once you classify those and determine what those are, you're able to kind of focus in the right direction of getting on track,
Well, I mean, my personal opinion is that we are already on some kind of a downward spiral.
We're on a train with no brakes, dude. I get it. I'm with you.
Yeah, we're at the end of the empire.
Star Wars? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the United States is an empire that is failing. That's the way I see it. And the consequence of that is that we will be getting more dysfunction, and we will be more under attack by our enemies than before. So I think there is already a major covert war going on between the West and some of the BRICS countries, in particular Russia and China. So we are living in a dangerous time, and that is very bad for democracy, because typically it leads to more authoritarian government when there are more threats, and especially if we are moving towards a major war in Europe or even a third world war, then it would potentially end democracy altogether. So that is a major concern that I have. And even in a better case that we avoid a major war, it could be a long period of decline. A long period of things just keep getting worse until it can get better.
I agree with you on that. I don't even think that's controversial. I think that's just pretty, if you're predicting where the times are going. I mean, we haven't really seen any reversals or any, giant changes or anything of the infrastructure to see it heading in a more positive direction. So, I mean, pessimistic view is what most people have at this point. Either that or they don't care. and I'm like, at least have a conversation about it, for God's sakes. I mean, you can't just worry about, what's going on Twitter and look, dude, you gotta, if you, like I said, if that controls your life, everybody hop off Twitter. Jesus. But Armin, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, man. I really do. Is there a place where people can find any of your links, anything you'd like to promote?
Not really.
Not a website or anything?
No, I don't. I mean, I just have my university webpage.
Okay.
So
Well, I'll link
I'm
that
at
in the
East Carolina
description.
University.
Are you off social media and everything?
No, I don't like it.
Good for you, dude. Good for you. I'm in the same boat. I post once a day and I'm done, dude. I can't. That's You get too addicted to that thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a way of influencing people. So I don't like the surveillance aspect. I never joined Facebook. I was always suspicious of it. And yeah, I guess I'm a little bit paranoid in that respect,
I
that
mean,
I don't
that's
like to put too much information about myself out
that's
to the public.
justified. You don't know that stuff's gonna haunt you in 5 years. And tell you that. I just logged my whole entire life and put it online. It's a dangerous thing. But Armin, I'm gonna link all your links in the description, man. Your website, at least profile links. And I appreciate the time you gave me to talk. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.